Well, howdy friends, Brian Flechsig of Mad River Outfitters and the Midwest Fly Fishing Schools, and welcome back to another one of our book reviews. And today I'm going to talk about what I think is actually a fairly simple but a very important book, and that was written by... Who was that written by?
Yeah.
Anyhow, welcome, Kelly Galloup, and Cripples Spinners is the book I'm talking about, and that was written by Kelly Galloup. And yes, Kelly, you know, I sometimes, everybody knows about the streamer stuff. Mm-hmm. But I think this is your forgotten book.
You know, I have often said that I should have written that one first.
Yeah.
Because most of my life, and still to this point, was dedicated far more to, and when I grew up, in the Swisher Richards era.
Right.
The first 20 plus years of my guiding career was almost exclusively dry fly. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what we did up there in Michigan, and everything was dry fly. And the most instrumental person in my life fishing-wise was Dave Ellis, and that's pretty much exclusively what he did.
Right.
And so writing it after the streamer books, that book was so massively successful, and it kind of pigeonholed me into that streamer thing. But I think I still fish dries more than I fish streamers.
Right.
I mean, if I can get in a boat, but a lot of times, every night I go dry fly fish, and but yeah, it was, it was a successful book, and I hear that a lot, and it's like, or if I don't hear that, I hear, oh, you fish dry flies?
Right.
Really? Do you do that? Do you have to? Does somebody force you?
Well, I think, and I read it when it first came out, which I think was sometime around, 2001, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And then I reread it again over the weekend, just knowing that you were going to be here and to talk about it. And there's so many things in this book that I agree with 100%. And that almost rarely happens. And it could be that this book, amongst many others, influenced me and helped me in my guiding and my fishing. But there's just so much practical knowledge, and a lot of times you call BS on a lot of conventional wisdom and the way people saw things. But I think the most important part, and also too, the equipment, when you talk about the rods and the reels and the lines and stuff, it's just dead on what we teach here on the channel, what we teach in our schools. And I think our philosophy, that's probably why we've been friends for 35 years. I think we see quite a few things eye to eye. Not always, but
not always.
But it's such a practical book, and it's such an important book when it comes to fly design and kind of slightly changing the way you think about fly design. And I think it's a way more influential book than a lot of people give it credit for. But in the book, you talk about the fly design, and I made some notes. You talk about the shape and dimension of a fly being the most important. And I absolutely 100% agree with that. And then comes the color.
Last, yeah.
Which is kind of funny. I've also studied, we've talked about this a little bit, but I studied Theodore Gordon quite a bit. I got into reading what little there is out there of him. And but he was in the father of modern American dry fly fishing. He was a color guy, even when it comes to dry flies. And if gray didn't work, he would switch to yellow. And if that didn't work, he would go to black. If that didn't work, he would go to white. And very rarely did you hear him talk about, of course, he mostly imitated mayflies. So the shape wasn't necessarily, but rarely did you hear him talk about the size. And I think I've heard you talk a little bit about size. The shape...
My first, but then size.
Okay.
But you think of that era, equipment, the hook sizes, and things like that. And the hook, they were generally pretty big too back then. And there was a lot of things that influenced it. And for me, Dave and Carl and Doug and Carl and Selective Trout. And if you I'm sure you have the book. You have more books than anybody ever met. But if you look at some of the early days, and I have some of the early pictures, when they first started doing the underwater, or not underwater, and they actually, most of them were in a cup. And you remember they showed they were looking up, and then no hackle comes out, and they're trying to say, it sits sit, and where it sits in the water. But then there was a bunch of underwater photographs, which we didn't have that before,
right.
and nobody even thought about it, right? We didn't even discuss what the fish sees, and so for me, mostly, it was common practice for me, and none of my things have ever come from. I don't read like you do, right? My brother, when I wrote my second book, he sent me a card, and he said, "Congratulations to the only man that's written more books than he's read." But there's something about that room temperature IQ. But he did say, or he didn't say anything. Mine was watching, right? I'm out there and I'm guiding so much, and I'm fishing myself so much. And so observation became a huge one. And as you know, I did tons of diving, and I started my diving long before the streamer stuff, which everybody knows I did that. I did it because I thought Gary LaFontaine was full of crap. And I started diving originally. I dove the Great Lakes for following smallmouth around and stuff like that, and looking for steelhead or at the mouths of the creeks and stuff like that. But then I was diving because I thought Gary was crazy. And then I realized he's about 30 years ahead of his time, maybe 50. I mean, I don't even know if we've caught up to him yet. The guy's a genius.
Right.
And so mine was observation, and much of it came from not a photo, but a sampling, kind of like this book that Ted Flechsig gave me all these pictures of the actual bugs. But I did a sample, and I had my daughter look at a fly, and I asked her if it looked like it, because they're all dead in the tray on their dining room table. And she goes, no. She's like 5, right? And out of the mouth of babes, And she goes, does this look like that fly? She goes, no, it looks like it's shocked.
Yeah. And
all of a sudden I saw the fly in a different view. And then I started looking things over. And so the observation aspect of it, back in the day, Gordon, and, even you can go back into the 70s even, and there was less observation and more. If you think about how new dry fly fishing is to our world, and this isn't something people did. Even my dad, who was a guide in 1940, the dry fly world didn't really emerge, and not that it wasn't here, but it didn't emerge radically until Swisher and Richards, if you ask me. Maybe a little before that. People were doing it. It's not they weren't doing it. It's just that suddenly, from a science base and from a observation where it wasn't just color and it wasn't just this, it wasn't that, it was silhouette, and it's like, what does the fish actually see? Ring of the Rise was a great one for that too. And so mine was more grassroots and guiding and seeing why didn't that work, right? And so it was, and in the old books, I read a lot of them, but I think there was a lot of common knowledge kind of passed through a lot of especially when you come out of the 60s and you start right up to where you see Doug and Carl's Selective Trout and Trout Strategies books start coming. And Hatches was another one, a spectacular book.
Yes.
And so then, but if you think about it, we're on our infancy. I mean, now it's 50 years later, 60 years later, but I mean, when you went from basically wet fly fishing, like my dad never talked about dry flies, and he's guiding on the Pier Marquette in 1940, and they didn't fish dry flies. They swung wet flies. That's just how it was. You got to cast the flies, and a lot of times you're fishing 2 or 3 or more flies, and it's a swing thing mostly. But I mean, people did it. Don't somebody write in and say, oh, there's some dry flies. I understand that, but as a practical thing, people did not start that, and exclusively once they started, of course now you got the dry or die thing comes out in the 80s, and where everybody's going to fish dries and like that. But I think a lot of knowledge that wasn't necessarily accurate kind of filtered through until you got well past the selective trout world, and then some of the more, the newer generation, the Mike Lawsons and Renee Harrops and the people like that come in and they start really, really techie water. A lot of the guys out in Pennsylvania, and now things are changing. And so, and when I'm doing, and that, because the streamer thing, I still was fishing 100 days on dry flies when I started the streamer thing. I mean, that's still what I'm doing. And it's, I was just looking at things from a different lens. It was just maybe these things are more important than we give them credit for. And one of them was color. As you know, in my streamer stuff, I think color's the number one thing. I think that's your first trigger. And then you adapt your speed or your retrieves or whatever, your style of your fly. But in this, and one of the things that got me was when I was underwater looking at a spinner. And it was a bright day. And I was under looking, with a mask and snorkel. And I couldn't see any color. Yeah. And I don't know if a trout sees, and I know they see in different spectrums and things like that. But I could, and it was a rusty spinner, and it was Dave Ellis's triple wing spinner. And I'm looking up, I can't tell what color it is.
Yeah.
I can see the silhouette, which is so perfect, right? It's got the three wings all married into one, and I can see that, and I'm looking up, but I can't tell you what color it is.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the fish does, but
same thing with fly lines.
Yeah, and that's why I started just doing. And it is a compilation of a whole bunch of basically of just 25 years of guiding dry flies
and thoughts, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's that drawing right there. That's the one that and I remember reading that, but I read it again, like I said, over the weekend, and I thought to myself, well, nobody was doing that. Even with an Adams, like you said, it's caught billions of fish. But still, you draw the silhouette like you did here in this book of a mayfly done, and then you draw the silhouette of an Adams. It's not going to be close at all. But that drawing right there, and I'm sure we'll get a close up of it, just that simple fact, and just taking it down to simple, basic observations, and that's what you did so well in this book, and it was really cool to read it again. I immediately went down to the vise and started tying triple wing spinners.
Yeah, that was a revelation.
Actually. I remember when that came out. That came out through Umpqua. That came out through Umpqua Feather Merchants, and I remember when that fly came out, and I said, oh my gosh, but I had never really completely thought about it from a flotation standpoint. I didn't actually think about it from the standpoint that you point out here, that wing takes up what, 1/3 or 2/3?
70%.
70%.
On a trico, it can be more.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what we were tying earlier, and we were talking about proportions and or stuff like that. Excuse me.
Yeah.
We were talking about that, and you start getting into a mayfly, especially your smaller ones. If you have a 15, 20% deviation from the actual fly. Now, if that's a streamer, it's this long, and you got a 15 or 20%, there's not much you're going to detect, right? If you take a fly that's 1/4 of an inch long, and you're 20% wrong, that's 1/4 of the fly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot, and it's a big change, right? And if you go back in time and you look at the wings, and particularly like the wings that would be skinny where they're tied in and flare out, well, that is the exact opposite of what a wing looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, completely. Or if you, and we just didn't, but we were trained. And I'm telling you, when I had Madison, my daughter, when she looked at that, and I started asking, she's very artsy, even as a child she was, right? And I had her look at it, and I would ask her, and she would say, like, I had a picture of some other flies that was in a magazine. And I said, what about this? She goes, no. She's always very honest, right? And it wasn't my fly, so I wasn't too offended.
Yeah.
But it was, and I realized that an awful lot what we do as tyers is, if we've been told, like originally when you'd see a spinner and it's out like this, or they'd tie the wings in so they're skinny at the body. We've been told that that's what they look like. And because, some famous fly tyer tied it, and we say, well, yeah, that looks just like one. And then you ask somebody that doesn't know anything about it, and I said, it doesn't look anything like it. Or if you do even worse, you do a silhouette drawing, which is what I did in that.
Yeah.
And I actually had one before that where I drew out the traditional spinner that had a single wing, which was encompassing less than 15% of the overall body. when the overall body silhouette of the wing is generally between 50 and 75 up to, and sometimes like in tricos, you can see them, it's like 90% of the overall body is the wing width. So if you see that, and now when you start looking up at that, realizing that it should be this big, yet it's this big, you got a huge problem, right? And so it was and that's, again, I've said this 1,000 times, that was Dave Ellis, who, he was always this guy that would see these observations before anyone else.
So you talk about Dave Ellis quite a bit. I've heard you talking about him for years. I've never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I know we were talking about getting together in Florida to teach some schools. You're going to go down and see him. He's still doing well.
85 and still out-time me by a mile.
Well, he is featured in the book. There's a great picture of him in here, and I know he's been a big inspiration to you over the years. So I know we could talk all night, but we just found out we have 1 minute left to talk about this fantastic book.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. No, it's Kelly Gallup's lost book. Although it's not lost, you probably still sell a lot of these. But you know, I think this is very underread for any trout fisher that likes to fish hatches.
Thank you.
And it was a pleasure to read it again. So thank you for doing it. And as always, very common sense, practical, no BS. Cripples and Spinners by Kelly Galloup. Of course, you can find it right here at madriveroutfitters.com or slidein.com, which is kind of a sister shop.
Kinda.
So, yep. So thanks as always for being here, and remember, read books. You should read more. I mean, Kelly's read 2 books in his life, and he came out this smart. So if you read a bunch of books, you'll be fine. Okay, there you go.
Close out, do an outro.
Thanks for watching, friends. As always, be sure to subscribe to our channel and read books and hit that like button. And thanks for watching, and watch that video, watch this video, and stay tuned. We got a lot more coming at you.